We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, we're in the midst of a cultural revolution that has really been affecting this country for some time. I know you're well aware of it if you've been listening to Point of View, and I certainly have seen how it's unfolded on the college campus. When I first started speaking in college classrooms back in 1976, it was already beginning and already very evident, but what has happened over this now almost 50 years is even more striking. So we're going to spend some time today talking about a new book, The Progressive Miseducation of America. It's going to be an opportunity to look at a number of things. First, many of the issues that we address here on Point of View having to do with the idea of a sexualized culture and gender identity, the whole issue of race, and how a variety of different kind of woke ideas have made their way into the society. And then number two, we'll spend some time talking about, well, how did this happen? And the really the origin of much of it, if you will, the font of all of that came from the university. So we're going to talk about what has been happening on the university campus and really get into this issue of cultural Marxism. And then number three, well, then how do we respond? Because we are in the midst of a very significant revolution. How do we respond to it? How can Christians make a difference? And I think you will find this very helpful as we talk about the progressive miseducation of America, confronting the cultural revolution from the classroom to your community. And it is written by Dr. Corey Miller. He's been on the program with us before. A seventh-generation Mormon who came to Christ, has become a pastor, a philosophy professor, campus minister, and is the president and CEO of Ratio Christi. We have a link to that on the website. Author of a number of books, has his PhD from University of Aberdeen, and joins us now by phone. So, Corey, welcome back to Point of View.
It's great to be back. Thanks. I appreciate what you guys are doing and letting me be part of it.
Let's, if we can, talk about revolutions, because in some respects, you talk about a first and a second and then a third revolution. And so before we get into the specifics, maybe we need to step back and give you a chance to give us some overview.
Yeah, using revolutionary language right now at this time, given what happened last week, it might throw people off. But I'm talking about an ideological revolution that has gone through the universities. I think a lot of people, maybe your audience is more familiar with it than others, an intelligible audience that understands where the universities came from, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. It was the Christians, really, who started, Oxford and Cambridge, came over here, the Puritans, the Pilgrims launched Harvard, Princeton, Yale. I get into that in my book and draw out the history of the university, but because I say that we are no longer living in Grandma's America today, we are in a cultural revolution, and I say look no further than the universities. People are often aghast at how awful the universities are right now. I mean, they know there are problems, but didn't we start the universities? And so I lay out the history, and then I show in detail in two phases how we lost the universities to scientific naturalism, which impacted the church by giving us liberal theology and the social gospel, and then most recently by postmodern cultural Marxism, giving us social justice. And this stuff has come out of the universities after decades of incubation and quickly moved into the corporate world, into K through 12, media, arts, and into every flora and fauna of the church. And so while we're living in that second one, I'm calling for a third revolution with the universities and for everybody to prepare for the ideology that's coming and pouring out of the universities into our churches, into our families, into our places of employment. You cannot go in the closet and escape this stuff.
Might just mention for our listeners out there that maybe have a child or a grandchild going off to the university, you run into both. The first revolution, as you say, has a lot to do with naturalism. And classically, especially when I first started speaking in classes, those were individuals that were atheist, agnostic. They believed in naturalism, that nature is all that there is, didn't believe in supernaturalism, but they still held to a little bit of kind of a liberal ideology. There were times when I'd have a professor say, you've had a chance to hear from me. I wanted to give you a different perspective, even if I disagree with it, from Mr. Anderson. And that was something that at least opened the door for a while. You are well aware that the campus really started closing down a couple of decades ago because of that second revolution of what you might call cultural Marxism or postmodernism, whatever phrase you want to use, which argues that, no, we don't want to hear the other side. There's no value in that. It's actually coming from people that are oppressors and we're victims. There is really no reason that you should give an equal platform to those individuals. And so in some respects, today, a university situation may have a little of both, although I think the second group are beginning to have more of a majority on campus. And it makes it very difficult for what you do on college campuses, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it sure does, because the first group, even though it was focused on scientific naturalism, lasted about a century. We had to start our new schools like Wheaton and Calvin and Biola. That was what was happening at that time in Westminster. They dominated, and then their last 20 years, it was sort of the reign of terror, the French Revolution, with not Robespierre, but Richard Dawkins at the head. Well, like Robespierre, who got beheaded by his own guillotine, Dawkins got the same, because the revolutionaries that he helped spark, or at least pave the way, now have come in from the social sciences and the humanities and have taken over in the hard sciences through what people call DEI programs and administrators, and I call DIE, for not just rhetorical purposes, but I've got a reason for it in trying to explain what DIE is and how it, and whether it's still there today. But the first revolutionaries, they often, followed along something like Voltaire would say. I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. These new revolutionaries are not liberal. They're illiberal. Stalin alleged to have said something more like, ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons, so why should we let them have ideas? This is the heart of cancel culture, and it's why cancel culture exists primarily on the left. And by left, I'm thinking more the illiberal Marxist left, not the classical liberal, even if they're atheists, left. They still want to have a conversation. And in fact, I ended up partnering with one noted atheist philosopher who wrote the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, when he invited me into his classroom and atheism seminar in Portland State to give arguments for God's existence. And then he proposed an alliance between us. He said, I'm done with the theism-atheism debate. I'm dedicating my career to attack the second revolution. He didn't call it that. But we, in fact, lectured together on the very campus Charlie Kirk was assassinated at, and we were talking about viewpoint diversity and free speech. And then we lectured on the campus where the assassin was first radicalized, and they tried to cancel us. So yeah, there is a difference between the two revolutions, and the one that's reigning now, that's the one we're having more of a hard time with.
By the way, we did talk about that, Professor, here on Point of View, but we need to take a break, continue our conversation on the Progressive Miseducation of America with Corey Miller, coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Depression in the U.S. has reached record levels. According to the latest Gallup poll, the percentage of U.S. adults who report having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime has reached 29%, nearly 10 percentage points higher than in 2015. This is a troubling statistic, especially at a time when the country is enjoying a level of prosperity. Treatment for depression has also increased. The percentage of Americans who currently have or have been treated for depression has also increased 17%, up 7 points over the same period. Those who were polled were asked, has a doctor or nurse ever told you that you have depression? And do you currently have or are you currently being treated for depression? The answers to both those questions became part of the ongoing Gallup National Health and Well-Being Index. It's also disturbing to discover which demographic groups show the greatest increase in depression. More than one-third of women report having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime. Women and adults aged 18 to 29 also have the highest rates of current depression or treatment for depression. Lifetime depression rates are also climbing among Black and Hispanic adults. In fact, these rates have now surpassed those of white respondents. In the past, white adults usually had marginally higher rates of both lifetime and current depression. The reasons for rising depression are many: social isolation, loneliness, and substance abuse. Christians might also add loss of meaning and rejection of the supernatural as other key factors. That is why I recommend that pastors and Bible teachers address the issue of depression and explain the medical, social, and spiritual factors to their congregation. This is an important issue the church cannot ignore. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Dr. Corey Miller, the Progressive Miseducation of America. Might just mention he was referring to, of course, the interview we did with him a number of years ago when he actually teamed up with this atheist professor, Dr. Peter Bohosian. We've got a couple of articles that are on our website by Corey Miller, as well as the interview, which, interesting enough, was 5 years ago, but nevertheless, it's just an illustration of sometimes you've had individuals that have been open-minded enough to allow that possibility. But let's get back to your book, because you have a section called Crosswords Puzzle, and that brings us back to critical theory, DEI, social justice, white guilt, equity, patriarchy, critical race theory, colonization, white privilege, on and on. It does seem to me that this whole glossary, this whole list of various terms is an illustration of the fact that we're in the midst of an ideological revolution.
Right. They've, through what is sometimes called soft power, what the cultural Marxists have done, and postmodern cultural Marxists, because it's really an amalgam of the two movements, is they come up with words, these new discourses, as it were, and they co-opt rather than coerce. And that was the trick of understanding to these cultural Marxists from classical Marxism how the West was ever going to be overcome. They had to look at the soft tissue of culture, which included academia, media, and ecclesia, and ensconce themselves into those areas. And part of it includes the soft power by co-opting certain words. So love is love, or diversity, inclusivity, equity, or equality, as it was called, justice, social justice, and so forth. They start to co-opt the words that are often used, and then they smuggle into the community, and they get the new meanings. And so they've got entire lexicons, right? There are speech codes, as it were, on university campuses, for example, of certain things you can't say. And this is relevant to like this week. And let me give you some of these. This was in 2017, and Bogosian and I began speaking in 2019, and it's gotten only worse since then. So 48% of students, according to a Yale study, and this is 8 years ago, believe that they should support campus speech codes. Now, we've litigated in universities over this. There are certain words you cannot say. 81% of words are a form of violence. Remember, not just that violence is violence, but words are violent.
Yes.
33% say physical violence is justified to prevent hate speech. That's 1 out of 3 students. And 66%, 2 out of 3, say that hate speech is anything a student believes to be considered hurtful to a particular person. So words are important to this new movement.
And I think it is illustrative by the fact that it isn't just relegated to the social sciences. In a preparation for you coming on the air, I do a daily commentary, and the last 2 days have been, interestingly enough, on woke science and then woke medicine. And a lot of that pulls from Heather McDonald's book as well as a variety of others. And so when we talk about this, it isn't just, well, if you take a sociology class, you're going to run into these woke ideas. You're finding it across the spectrum in all of academia, aren't you?
Right, and that's the way that they jump the tracks. See, the scientific naturalists, and especially the new atheists, they paved the way by trying to burn down Christianity in the West. And I told Peter Boghossian at that time, okay, I will ally with you, but remember, you guys created this monster on the other side, and now you want an alliance because you can't stop this Frankenstein. And so it came out of the humanities and social sciences, but through the DEI or DIE programs, it jumped over the tracks into math, medicine, and engineering, areas that should not even be touched by this stuff. And then from there, as it always goes, ideas have consequences and bad ones make victims. It moves from the campus to the culture, upstream to downstream.
And again, part of that gets back to the university. I was thrilled to see that you quote Charles Malik. I remember first hearing his name mentioned, I think it was first by Bill Bright and even by Francis Schaeffer, but you have a number of individuals that are notable, recognizing that historically we have expected the university to be a place where we teach about what is good and right and beautiful, and certainly that which is part of the foundation of Western culture. But maybe you can explain now, having spent so many years on the college campus, how did that change? Because as you simply point out, this is not Grandma's America anymore.
Right. So remember, Harvard began in 1636, shortly after the Puritans got there. Its motto was truth, or veritas, and it quickly changed it to truth for Christ and the church. And that motto lasted almost 300 years until about 1936 when it was scrubbed. Well, what was happening after all the colonial schools were started, and for the first 200 or something years, every president was also a member of the clergy.
Mm-hmm.
And this was all the way up until 1840. And the chief capstone class in their senior year would be given on moral philosophy by the president. But after you rip out Christianity and a metaphysical basis, the foundation for Western ethics, after you rip that out, there's no more capstone class for moral philosophy. What was happening by the time you get to the 1880s, the revolution had begun. We were sending our students, because we had no grad schools, over to Europe, and particularly to the one who had almost all the PhD programs, Germany.
Yeah.
And our best and brightest would go there. They would get impacted by the German ideology. They would come back, and the battle was on for 50 years until 1930. And many of the conservative Christians were ousted. We had to start over with the second phase of universities. And right at that time, in the 1930s, you mentioned Charles Malik. He needed to get out of Europe at that time, and he came to America. He was a Christian philosopher, got his PhD from Harvard. He was a UN Secretary General and the senior architect on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, a Christian. And so we named the Malik Academic Fellowship after him, where we are funding PhD students to get into top 100 schools for the long march of the institutions to take these back over time. But in the 1930s, there was this little school called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory over in Germany. and that is neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. And they were the ones now applying it to race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And down below them in the Axis powers of Marxism was Antonio Gramsci, who never got out of prison, but his prison notes got mediated into the English-speaking world right here in my state of Indiana at Notre Dame by a Marxist professor with the name Joseph Buttigieg, father of Mayor Pete.
Yes.
And so these Axis powers of socialism or Marxism, they had to get out of town when the Nazis rose to power, the National Socialists, because these guys were globalists, not nationalists. They were all socialists. And they all came to American universities, to Columbia and Brandeis and UCLA. And then within 15 years from that time, the French, you might look at this as the Vichy government, the founders of postmodernism like Derrida, deconstructionism,
right,
or Lyotard, or Foucault, and so forth. Those guys of postmodernism, you might think of that as relativism and other descriptions, they were also card-carrying members of the French Communist Party or sympathizers. They all came over to the American top universities too. And so you get both revolutions coming over to the U.S. universities, and over time, these guys began to grow. They bided their time through the 60s revolution, but part of them were what was infusing what was called the new left. And that's what I'm saying is leftism today, the Marxist left, not the liberal left. These guys are not liberal, they're illiberal. And by the time you get to the 90s, Kerby, the ratio of liberal to conservative professor in the universities was about 2.3 to 1. It is now 12 to 1
right,
for those retirement age and 23 to 1 for those who just got tenure and have another 30 years ahead of them. And if you want to go to the top schools, the Ivy Leagues, it's 27 to 1. And just last month, Yale University gave their stats from their social sciences and humanities, 78 to 1. This is a virtual monopoly. And so we're sending our kids as fish in a barrel, and parents and grandparents are sending them in and paying for the apostasy of their own children.
Wow. Need to take a break, and when we come back, we will continue this conversation about the Progressive Miseducation of America. We've been talking about, of course, cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School. Some of that information is not only in this book, but in some of the booklets that we have, and it's just one of those reasons why we encourage you to listen to Point of View every day. As we go through this, you might find yourself saying, I'd like to pass this on to others, and you certainly can do so. You can go to that button that says Watch or Listen, or find it posted later as one of the shows. I think there are others that would benefit from hearing this conversation. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Corey Miller. By the way, the foreword by Everett Piper has been on the program with us before. Just a great endorsement, and many other individuals that have endorsed his book, individuals that we've interviewed on this program, like Sean McDowell and Lucas Miles and John Stone Street and Frank Turek and Natasha Crane, just to mention a few. But I thought, Corey, for just a minute, we've been talking about what's been going on in the university, but you do sort of raise the question, what was happening with the Christians? And you even have a section, what hath Jesus to do with knowledge? And I think it is fair to say that certainly the universities were overrun and Christians were kicked out. But isn't it also fair, and you can agree or disagree, but isn't it at least fair to say that sometimes there's got to be sort of an anti-intellectual bent in Christianity? And so we really weren't doing the kinds of things your ministry is doing in terms of knowing how to defend biblical truth. And it brings us back to why I certainly want to endorse your organization and endorse, for example, many of the people that endorsed your book that do the area of apologetics.
Yeah, no doubt. During that time in the New England area, you also had other things going on. Charles Finney was around preaching, and he died in 1875. And a lot of the sermons were given were, emotional. People were drawn to conversions, and oftentimes without having an equipped mind. So we get the heart, we get the hands of Christianity. And, this is, remember, I said around 1880 to 1930 was the time of the university takeover for the First Revolution. Well, D.L. Moody is also around that time, and he said, gave a famous statement, don't polish the brass on a sinking ship. Mm-hmm. In other words, souls are going down, just get the souls off. And so since then, we've focused on Harvest Crusade after Harvest Crusade after Harvest Crusade, trying to win souls. But as every farmer knows, you cannot reap a harvest if you are not sowing seeds. And that is true also in the most influential institution shaping civilization right now, the universities. And so we literally have excommunicated the life of the mind. We've got this menace of mindless Christianity, a book that Mark Knoll, historian, wrote 30 years ago, I think this month, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind.
Yes.
And he said that the scandal was that there isn't much of an evangelical mind, and that has not changed a lot. So we have been focused on the hands of Christ and the heart of Christ at the expense of the head of Christ, and so we have literally lost our minds, lost the universities, and it's impacted the churches as well.
Might just mention, too, we do have a link to your website, and you can find out more about local chapters, professors, high school, kind of the global impact and the rest. Of course, we also have information about the book, and if you find it in your local bookstore, great, but we know that sometimes is difficult, so if you'd like to get it in paperback or Kindle, it's published by our good friends at Harvest House. I think you will appreciate that as well. Well, by now, some people are thinking, all right, I know we got a problem. You didn't have to convince me, and I recognize maybe even if you use big words like postmodernism or cultural Marxism, I'm not sure what's going on, but it seems to me that a lot of people right now are thinking, well, what about the third chapter then? Because you're talking about, the third section, I should say, a third revolution, and that is how we should respond. And one of the quotes comes from James Davidson Hunter, To Change the World. It's been many years since we've had him on, but he talks about the fact that cultures change from the top down, rarely if ever from the bottom up. And so winning a soul here or there is good, but if the collective force of the culture is against you, you really have to recognize how important it is to make an impact in media and in the universities. And that's certainly the ministry that you have, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, if we look at the history of revivals and things like that in America, going down to Azusa, to Asbury, to Yale, and other places, these are usually connected to college campuses. And it goes back even further to Dr. Martin Luther, Professor Martin Luther in Wittenberg at the Protestant Reformation. That's because this is where young people are at. It's the ideological or ideas center of the world, and these professors are gatekeepers. And so it's important that we consider a re-infiltration, or for the first time for us, because we started the universities, an infiltration of the universities. We need to be thinking like the cultural Marxists, the long march through the institutions. And so in that third section of the book, I basically say we need to resurrect thoughtful Christianity, number one. That means not just loving God with our hearts and our hands, but also with our heads. After all, Jesus commanded us to love God with our minds. And because of this second revolution, focusing so much on not that Christianity's faults, but that it's wicked and oppressive and hateful. Isn't that why Charlie Kirk just got killed? Because of all his hatred for disagreeing with, some ideas that culture has adopted 15 seconds ago. We need to be able to show that Christianity is good for the world, for civilization. And I get into that in the book, give some arguments on that, cultural apologetics, and that it is reasonable and that it is true. And so this is a resurrection of apologetics as a main tool that our ministry should be using. Pastors should be using it. Parents should be using it. We should be equipping our kids to go off to the secular baptismal font, and not just to be able to survive, but to thrive. And then I have a clarion call directly to pastors, to parents and grandparents, to parachurches, political allies, professors and educators, philanthropists, and prayers. All hands on deck. It's the university, stupid. Not everyone's called to go into the university like Ratio Christi is. That's fine. But everybody needs to prepare. They need to know in order to prepare what the ideas are coming out of the university, impacting our families, our churches, our kids. Again, you cannot go into the closet on this one. And they're coming into the closet through iPhones, through their friends, and other means. And so, we wonder why so many parents, we're seeing a phenomena that, typically conservative Christian parents are starting to go progressive, because so many of the kids are trans kids now because of the social contagion. The rhetoric, again, that the left likes to use is, Mom, Dad, would you rather have a living daughter or a dead son? You choose. And so the parents are forced to then compromise just to keep the life there, and they start to move into progressive Christianity. They start to deconstruct as well. And so the entire church is starting to move left. And this movement has infiltrated the churches, the campus ministries, the Christian academic societies, and the seminaries. The barbarians are no longer at the gates, Kirby. They're in the citadel.
Yep. And they have tenure in many cases. Let me, for just a minute, come back to something you just mentioned in passing, because if you could even take part of this book out and make it a small book, it would be valuable, because you have the chapter on, is Christianity good for the world? Is Christian belief reasonable? And is Christian belief true? And each one of about 20 pages, and it really answers some important questions. Just before I take a break, I thought we'd just mention the first one, because I've had, Corey, people on this program, individuals been doing apologetics for maybe decades, saying, it used to be when I was on a college campus, I would start with making the case for whether or not it was reasonable to believe in Christianity, or even whether or not Christianity was true. But I've had to back up, because so many of them have bought the argument that God is not good, that Christianity is evil, and I've had to really address, as you do in chapter 10, is Christianity good for the world? And it does seem to me that that's one of those new issues that we're going to have to address in the future.
Yeah, that's right. It's not your typical existential argument for God's existence, asking the question, does God exist? It's an axiological argument, asking, would God's existence, should he exist, be something you would want? Is it desirable? Are there features that come along with God's existence that make the world a better place, versus if God didn't exist, it wouldn't have these features? For example, the sanctity of human life. Peter Boghossian at Princeton, a university I'll be lecturing at on this in February, he wrote the book, The Unsanctifying of Human Life, and that is, since we now know that God doesn't exist, we can no longer rely on this fundamental moral principle that has guided Western civilization, the sanctity of human life. And look at the results of that. Why is the assassination culture predominantly on the left, the culture of death, and so forth? Conservative Christians are the ones who adopt. Conservative Christians are the ones who have a culture of life.
Wow.
It's because beliefs precede behavior.
We're going to take a break and come back and spend a little bit more time on that, but it's all part of this book, The Progressive Miseducation of America. Dr. Kerby Miller with us. This book, again, is published by Harvest House. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention again, the book is entitled The Progressive Miseducation of America, Excellent Diagnosis as well as a Prescription. So we'll continue to talk about that for a few more minutes with Dr. Kerby Miller. If you find yourself maybe knowing or thinking of somebody that needs to hear this, think about passing it on to them. Of course, we have some links there so you could let them know about the existence of this book, and you will probably hear about it again because I'm planning on taking some very great insights on so many of these 300 plus pages and using them in some of my commentaries. But I thought, Kerby, for just a minute. Your chapter on all hands on deck is something you were alluding to, that one of the hands on deck should be parachurch and campus ministries, pastors, church leaders, and churches. And I thought we'd start there, but later you want to talk, of course, to parents, grandparents, and even philanthropists and donors. But since we have a number of pastors and Christian leaders listening to Point of View, what would you say to them?
Well, there are very good pastors and Christian leaders, and there are very poor ones. When we look at the information coming out in our Christian sociological studies of those who hold a biblical worldview, the Worldview Project, we saw that in 2022, only 6% of Americans hold a biblical worldview, and that isn't as technical as you might think. It's like you believe God exists, all humans are sinners, the Bible's God's word, Jesus is the only way, absolute truth exists. 6 or 7 different things. Only 6% in 2022. In 23, it dropped down to 4%. 37% of American pastors hold a biblical worldview. But I guess there's reason for optimism because 51 to 50% of evangelical or non-denominational pastors hold a biblical worldview. That's reason to celebrate. That's a major problem. Too many of our churches are caught up in skinny jeans and fog machines or whatever the latest fad is, rather than equipping our people for works of ministry through Christian thought, through strong biblical sermons, Bible studies, good discipleship, and apologetics. Apologetics needs to be a factor in today's discipleship, in evangelism. As 1 Peter 3:15 says, you've got to be prepared to give an answer to everyone asks you, to give the reason for the hope that's in you with gentleness and respect. That's a command. We see the head, the heart, and the hands there. And so for pastors, we need to be equipping these parents. It's a rough time for parents, too, because both parents are working now. It's a hard economic situation. Part of it's been brought on maybe by feminism. Part of it's been brought on by careerism. There are now more women who are enrolled in undergrad, graduate, and PhD programs, and the average first birth of a woman in America today is now age 30. That's got its own demographic problems, but they're being influenced by these universities as well. But it's hard to make it out there, and so parents are exhausted, and they want to sometimes be tempted to hand their kid off to the youth pastor. No. At best, that should contribute to what you're doing, but these are your kids. Train them up in the way they should go, and when they get older, they get conscripted to work for the other side. That's actually what's happening when they go off to the secular baptismal font. So, look, if pastors got a lot to do, parents have a lot to do, then partner with organizations that are already doing it and can provide easy resources. There are tons of organizations I mentioned in the book that are doing it. We are one of them, and we have, for example, Kerby, these booklets. You had mentioned booklets, I think, a moment ago. We have these booklets. It's a product line from Ratio Christi, over 50 of them by scholars like William Lane Craig and Stephen Meyer, and a ton of, they're all written by PhDs at the 11th grade reading level, 25 pages, digital or printable, on everything from the problems of science, the history of the Bible, why God allows evil, to the now cultural apologetics, race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And for example, the one who wrote the one on transgender not only has a PhD, but also was transgender. The one who wrote it on homosexuality not only is working on her PhD, but was lesbian. The one on Is Christianity a White Man's Religion? Not only was black, but he's still black. Ha ha ha. But he's got a doctorate. And so we have area experts. This is very concise. It's small, bite-sized chunks, and there's more in there if you need more for the author who's written 500, 600-page books. Those are on our website. People can go there, give us their email address, and they can download these for free, or they can order the hard print copies for their Sunday schools. Sean McDowell uses them for one of his classes. I know Purdue professors that use them. So they're good for high school, for parents, for professors, to equip our people. We need this. And so I just want to give people a link to both the book web page for us and also where you can find these booklets. And if you want to invite me to come and speak, I'm beginning a speaking tour on campuses, churches, and conferences and so forth, go to Ratio, ratio.link/PMA for Progressive Miseducation. Ratio.link/PMA. You'll find it all there.
Again, we have RatioChristi.org, and you can find the publications there, the About Us, and some of the links there as well. And I just think it's a great organization that people need to know more about. And, of course, one of the things you also say near the end is philanthropists and other donors. The sad reality is, and Corey, you know this only so well, we oftentimes have people that can raise great amounts of money for evangelistic crusades, and as great as that is, and as important as that is, we have to also recognize how the life of the mind and these issues is really very important. And so I think that's one of those things where, again, we can not only be praying for you and inviting you to come and speak, but we should also and need to also address some of those issues, because if we do not, we're really not going to be able to make the kind of impact that we need to make and really begin to turn the culture around. So if nothing else, I would highly recommend that people go to the website, and we've provided that on the website. And again, the book, The Progressive Miseducation of America, Dr. Corey Miller has been with us, and it is published by Harvest House. And it's always been great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Hey, thank you so much, Kerby, for providing the opportunity, the platform to tell people about what the problem is going on in America and what the solution is.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about some issues in the news. But if you have not gone to our website and dealt with our Take Action item, I thought I would mention it again. It's the middle section there, and what we're encouraging you to do is write to your 2 United States senators. It's really very simple. Senate Bill 88, No Budget, No Pay Act. It seems to me that we can keep kicking the can down the road, or we can ask Congress to actually have the same kind of fiscal discipline that we require from governors and state legislatures around the country. And so this is an argument to be made that if indeed you don't come up with a budget, we will dock your pay for every day that you fail to pass key budget resolutions. Not that difficult. Other states do it. Federal government should do it. And here we are once again coming to what is the end of the fiscal year for the United States government, end on September 30th. Will we have a budget on October 1st? I think you know the answer to that. So we give you an opportunity to contact your 2 United States senators and go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on the button that says Take Action, and this is something that you can then use to contact your 2 senators, express your opinion about something that we think is a chronic problem that needs to be addressed. All that available at the website at pointofview.net. When you go there, if you want to get a copy of the book, The Progressive Miseducation of America, let me encourage you to do that as well. When we come back, we've got quite a number of articles we'll be quoting from and information we'll be bringing. All that coming up right after this.
As you likely know, our nation is approaching its 250th anniversary. And at Point of View, we are on a mission to restore America's godly heritage. But we do need your help. The first step in restoring America's godly heritage is educating people about the biblical truth that shaped our nation, including the truth that God is our creator and the source of our rights, the truth that people, including those in government, are prone to sin, and the truth that freedom requires internal moral guidance, which comes from belief in God. Point of View educates listeners on these truths every day, but we need support from people like you in order to operate. The best way to join in our mission to restore America's godly heritage is by joining the Truth Team. Learn more at pointofview.net. Or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's get into some of the issues in the news. And before we get into some of the articles we've posted, I think it's worth mentioning that Jimmy Kimmel Live is no longer. Jimmy Kimmel has been pulled, and that is a decision made by ABC, which will relate back to something we'll talk about with our second article. We'll get to that soon enough. But it's some of the things that Jimmy Kimmel's been saying for some time, but even some of the things he said about Charlie Kirk that caused not only ABC to rethink it, but caused some ABC affiliate stations to say, we're not going to air Jimmy Kimmel Live any longer. And that all of a sudden got everybody's attention, since his numbers and his ratings and even the income probably coming to ABC was even lower than Stephen Colbert. So he is no longer. He is furious about that, and I'm sure he's going to show up on Stephen Colbert's program, and we're going to hear a lot more, but we will see about that in the future. While we're talking about Charlie Kirk, if you have not seen, Erica Kirk has been named today as the CEO and also the chairman of the board of Turning Point USA. So if you have not heard that, well, you heard it first here on Point of View. And of course, there are a variety of other issues that we will certainly talk about. Let me mention one economic issue, and that is yesterday, the Federal Reserve Board had announced and met, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, of course, is Jerome Powell, announced that a 25 basis point cut. For those of you that don't understand Federal Reserve economic speak, that means 0.25%. That is almost not newsworthy, because almost everybody expected something. What may be more newsworthy, and something we might talk about in the future, is whether or not there are 2 or 3 more cuts coming, which I suspect there are, and we'll probably deal with some of those economic issues in the future. As a matter of fact, we might even talk about it tomorrow, because we have Kelly Shackelford and Merrill Matthews with us. Merrill Matthews and I like to get into some of the economic issues. If not, we will certainly cover some of those next week on Point of View. So anyway, just a couple of quick notes of changes in not only the ABC lineup, but changes at Turning Point USA, and we'll see how that unfolds. First article here actually is one came out yesterday, but I postponed it till today, by Jim Garrity. We tend to quote him from time to time, and he spent some time really trying to address this issue, which we will come back to again tomorrow. His article has the title, "The Media Are Incapable of Covering Left-Wing Violence." The article that we are going to post for tomorrow, and actually are starting to post right now, which we'll talk about tomorrow with Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford, is the left's vast knowledge, lack of knowledge of the, if you will, the conservatives and even the culture at large. As I've pointed out before, we all sort of live in our bubble. But if you go to the Charles Murray book, or the particular test that he put together, which has even been used by NPR, you can find out that some of the people that live in the most insulated bubble are people that are the left, people that live in New York City, people that live in Silicon Valley, and unfortunately, a lot of the media is located in New York City, but even if it's located in Atlanta, CNN is there, there is still a self-reinforcing idea. And so he takes on a couple of individuals that I will skip over, but you might want to read because they are kind of intriguing to see how, in this case, he's critical of Matt Gutman, and he was criticized quite a bit by a number of other people on the way in which they covered it. But the point is that at the very end of this long monologue, he then talks about how this was kind of heartbreaking and kind of touching that individual that is just brutally assassinated or killed, murdered, whatever phrase you want to use. Charlie Kirk is then in a text writing back to his boy, now becoming a girl, transgender, romantic, and that's sort of like it was looking back at Romeo and Juliet. And so there is a sense in which even after that came out, he went back to then try to maybe pick up the pieces and try to explain. He said, yesterday I tried to underscore the jarring contrast between this cold-blooded assassination of Charlie Kirk, a man who dedicated his life to public dialogue, and the personal disturbing text read aloud by the Utah County Attorney at the press conference. He says, I deeply regret that my words did not make that clear, but let me have zero doubt here. I unequivocally condemn the horrific crime and pain that it caused Charlie Kirk's family, those who were forced to witness it at UVU, and the millions of people he inspired. But the question, and that's the point we're going to focus on right now, is why is the mainstream media like this? So he picks on one individual, but then he reminds us that when, for example, he says the media is confronted with a horrible situation where someone who identified with the left did something terrible and someone on the right is an innocent victim, why is it you feel this urge to romanticize the perpetrator? And he says, in recent days, we've witnessed a full court press from Lawrence Tribe, who almost became a Supreme Court justice, and Jimmy Kimmel, and of course I just mentioned him a minute ago, to Reuters, condemning that Charlie Kirk's assassination or assassin or killer, murder, again, whatever phrase you want to use, had to be a right-wing figure. He says, why is there this reflexive refusal to believe that someone who identifies as being on the left side of the political spectrum could do something terrible and violent? And then he goes in and talks about the assassin or the individual, the murderer of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, and how individuals referred to him, that is the killer, as a morally good man or as revolutionary or as famous or handsome or smart or young. That's pretty amazing, and he gives you the link so you can follow it yourself. Or he says, I'm still waiting, and I heard somebody mention this the other night, that we've never seen on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine a picture of any of those people that were killed by that bomb that was set off at the Boston Marathon, but the lone surviving perpetrator was on the cover. And then he, of course, talks about some things we've mentioned before, how one of these individuals, Omar Jimenez, who is standing in front of riots in August 2020 in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and referred the riots as fiery but mostly peaceful, when behind him you can see buildings engulfed in flames. And he just tends to also point out the fact that there is just this steadfast unwillingness in some cases to acknowledge evil and to acknowledge that some of that evil could come from within your house. So we'll come back and get into a little more detail, but also that brings us to the next article, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Why does it really matter whether it was a person from the left or the right who killed somebody? And I'll explain that because that piece by Dan McLaughlin I thought was very helpful as well. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, we'll spend our time finishing off this first article and work our way into the second article. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Depression in the U.S. has reached record levels. According to the latest Gallup poll, the percentage of U.S. adults who report having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime has reached 29%, nearly 10 percentage points higher than in 2015. This is a troubling statistic, especially at a time when the country is enjoying a level of prosperity. Treatment for depression has also increased. The percentage of Americans who currently have or have been treated for depression has also increased 17%, up 7 points over the same period. Those who were polled were asked, has a doctor or nurse ever told you that you have depression? And do you currently have or are you currently being treated for depression? The answers to both those questions became part of the ongoing Gallup National Health and Well-Being Index. It's also disturbing to discover which demographic groups show the greatest increase in depression. More than one-third of women report having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime. Women and adults aged 18 to 29 also have the highest rates of current depression or treatment for depression. Lifetime depression rates are also climbing among Black and Hispanic adults. In fact, these rates have now surpassed those of white respondents. In the past, white adults usually had marginally higher rates of both lifetime and current depression. The reasons for a rising depression are many: social isolation, loneliness, and substance abuse. Christians might also add loss of meaning and rejection of the supernatural as other key factors. That is why I recommend that pastors and Bible teachers address the issue of depression and explain the medical, social, and spiritual factors to their congregation. This is an important issue the church cannot ignore. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a minute, continue on with this issue. But as I've oftentimes said, sometimes we should keep the microphone on during the break, because Steve Miller, my producer, and I were having the conversation, because in some respects, you recognize how we've glorified people in the past. You know, you think of Bonnie and Clyde, or you go even back to Billy the Kid or whatever, or even more recently, I mentioned Charles Manson, whatever example you want to use. And there are individuals that once you have a criminal, you find out that there are individuals that want to marry that individual when they're in prison, or we have the legend of Billy the Kid. And in some respects, maybe some of that existed where initially we were, as a culture, horrified by something, but over time the legend built up, and especially when the pain subsided, we maybe tended to glorify some people that didn't need to be glorified. But in this world where we're just constantly assaulted, if you will, by all these visual images, first of all, we tend to be a lot more numb to a lot of that, and also the speed of all that picks up, and all of a sudden we're talking about all sorts of things that we would have never considered before, not the least of which is I tend not to use the name of the individual that killed Brian Thompson, but his name is Luigi Mangione, and we have an Emmy-nominated primetime special on that. And so in some respects, what before maybe took some time for us to have some revulsion has changed dramatically. He then points out one other example, and I could go through this very long series of articles, but I thought I would at least mention the other one that came to mind, and that is Antifa. It turns out now we have the government labeling Antifa as a domestic terrorist group. You can agree or disagree, but here Jim Garrity gives you a link, and every one of these words I'm saying has a link to it, so you can see that Antifa, which is supposed to be anti-fascist, has a long history of vandalism, a link, attempted arson, a link, successful arson, a link, building incendiary devices and improvised explosive devices, there's another link, harassment, a link, stalking, a link, shootings, a link, looting, burglary, one case of murder, all of those. And in the midst of all of that, you have NPR's, National Public Radio's Mara Liasson, who actually referred to Antifa, which I think most of us would call them thugs, or if we want to use a more positive term, hooligans. That's a British term. But she compared them to the Allied forces landing in Normandy. Please. And so there's just a inability sometimes to understand that you may have evil in your own house. And so we've, of course, come to the both sides do it argument. And I, of course, gave you the list yesterday. I call it the list. And the list, of course, reminds us that we do have individuals that have been attacked, like Rand Paul, or we can use Steve Scalise, but they will also mention somebody like Gabby Gifford, or sometimes state officials, the arson of Pennsylvania Governor Manchin, Josh Shapiro's mansion, or Mark and Melissa Hartman. But in addition to that, we've already mentioned some of these others, and I think it's good illustration of why the second article I've posted from Dan McLaughlin says why it matters that Charlie Kirk's killer came from the left. And he begins by saying that in the press conference, you had the county attorney laying out all sorts of excerpts from the text messages, which I just mentioned, and then goes on to show that it's pretty obvious that he had left-leaning motives. And so this left-leaning individual was then being portrayed as a right-leaning individual. As he said, this effort was pretty high risk at the time because even before we knew the details, it was, possible that this was somebody from the far right, but it was never a likely outcome. And then once we began to find out that that narrative didn't work, well, then we got the next one. This Hawaiian senator, who is the whip of the Democratic Senate caucus, said, what the blank difference does it make if this murder was left or right? Pull yourself together, read a book, get some exercise, have a whiskey or walk the dog or make some pasta, go fishing or do just anything, and don't let this pickle your brain and ruin your soul. For those of us that are Monty Python listeners and aficionados, it's a little bit like the king of the swamp camp castle. Remember that? Let's not bicker and argue who killed who. Well, okay. Try to inject a little humor, poorly so, I guess, in this. But here, it really is important if you think about this. Charlie Kirk, who I quote so often, made the case the other day, and that is, it would be a travesty if the history books were to actually say that the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. by a white racist was something that was actually not motivated by race. Right? It would, and that maybe it was similar to the individual that tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan, who was just so unbalanced we didn't even give him a prison sentence. One obviously is politically motivated, and the other is not. And that brings us back to a couple of points, because Dan McLaughlin says we've seen a number of political assassination attempts or assaults in recent years by people who were clearly much more mentally deranged than they were coherent politically. And I thought it was interesting because he included the assassination of Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hartman and the gunman who shot Representative Gabby Giffords, or even the other individual that attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. And interestingly enough, at least two of those individuals are oftentimes used as examples of political violence. And I think the honest assessment there would be not really the case. In some cases, we're dealing with people that are mentally unbalanced, and that was not politically motivated. And so Gabby Giffords, a representative who is a Democrat, was shot by the gunman. Well, what about the gunman that actually came to a baseball field where there only were Republicans practicing for the congressional baseball game and shot Steve Scalise? I don't think you can call that just a mentally unbalanced individual, given his proclivity and his political background, and given some of the statements he made, and given the fact that he wasn't just shooting somebody in random, he was deliberately going after Republican figures. And so in some respects, even though I put some of those names on what I call the list, whether it is Gabby Giffords or whether it is some of the other individuals that have been shot at, like Mark and Melissa Hartman, I would have to say that many of those probably don't even qualify as something that would be really political violence, which brings me back to the statistic that was rattled out the other day by one of the most prominent Democrats, who said, we have evidence that 76%, notice 76%, not 3/4, but 76% of political violence comes from the extreme right, and only 4% come from the extreme left. I mean, again, the only way you get that is to discount almost anything done by the left and to overcount those on the right. I don't care, but I do think in some respects we do a disservice if we were to not understand the political motivation for things like, if you will, the assassination of people like Martin Luther King Jr. Do you see the point? One last column I won't really get into in much detail, but it's Ann Coulter saying that the biggest development coming out of Charlie Kirk's murder last week is that the gun isn't to blame. This time it's social media. And she goes on to explain this steadfast unwillingness to acknowledge that maybe there's a transgender component there, because she points out that transgender individuals are at most 1% of the population, which she says that's about the same as the percentage of Americans who are deaf or missing a limb or have eyes of two different colors. And then by time that you get to the rest of that, she now gives you 2 pages full of individuals who have a transgender background, who either have shot at or specifically have killed individuals, and to say that that is not significant and that we need to not look at the issue of motivation, transgender, but instead we'll blame it on the guns, although you couldn't really blame the Charlie Kirk one on a gun that would not be banned by most gun control advocates, so we'll blame it on social media. It's just a reminder once again of the inability of the media sometimes to honestly assess what may be taking place. All the more reason for us, as we say on this program so many times, for you to exercise discernment. We come back, though, going to talk about socialism and capitalism. It's a big issue, which we'll talk about today and tomorrow, right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about capitalism and socialism. First of all, there is a very good reason for that, and that is Merrill Matthews suggested that we might talk about this new poll that has come out, and it says capitalism is out and socialism is in. I've had a lot of listeners say, do you really believe that Zoran Mamdani will be the next mayor in New York City, which has been kind of the center of free market capitalism for the world? And the answer is yes. First of all, I don't think it's been the center of that because in some respects, sometimes people reject capitalism and not really rejecting the idea of a free market. They're rejecting crony capitalism, which we should, I think, in some respects, be critical of as well. But that's not the point. When we look at these surveys, we're seeing the younger you are, the more likely you are to believe that socialism is superior to capitalism. So, first of all, if we want to give you some resources, if you go to the Point of View website right now, first of all, you click on that first button that says See More. Then you scroll down and you will see that we have our booklets. One, a biblical view on capitalism and socialism, and a biblical view on socialism. I'll explain the difference of those in just a minute, but what you do is you click on the button that says See More, and you can read it. If you say, well, I'd like to download it, go to the bottom. There's a little down arrow, and if you click on that, it says download, and you can then download that. Or if you say, well, I'd rather have the booklet in my hands, well, here we are. I have both those booklets. We'd be glad to mail them to you. But if you are an individual that has been donating to us, if you're part of the Truth Team, you may have already received them. But if you'd like to get an extra copy, we've got a box full of them, so we could send a printed one to you. But we've made it very easy for you just simply to download that if you go to the website. So if you have a computer, you should be able to do that. If you're maybe struggling with how to download that, just find a 15-year-old kid and they'll help you out. I mean, that's how we're going to get that done, and we wanted to make that available to you. The survey, I think, illustrates part of the problem, and that is surveys are surveys, but in this survey, they actually took the time, let's give them credit at least, for defining democratic socialist and capitalist. Democratic socialists were defined as those who believe that government should take a more active role to improve Americans' lives. They generally support higher taxes on corporations and high-income earners, support regulations to protect workers and consumers, and want more public ownership of key industries like housing, healthcare, and utilities. That's the key point, because some of the others are really kind of positive. But then capitalists are described as believing in a private sector is best equipped to make improvements to Americans' lives, generally support lower taxes, oppose government regulations on businesses, which I think is maybe a little bit of a negative there, want the private sector to own key industries like housing, healthcare, and utilities. If you use that definition, 3/4 of likely Democratic voters say we like democratic socialism more than we like capitalism. 3/4 to 74% to 16%. And, of course, a plurality of Republicans and independents preferred capitalism. So what about that? Well, if you get that first booklet on capitalism and socialism, we remind you of the fact that this has been a chronic problem. We give you, I think, a little better definition of that. But we also point out that most people in America recognize that capitalism or the free market has allowed for the incredible increase in the status of individuals around the world. And I give you one quote from Arthur Brooks, who wrote a very good book, The Battle, How the Fight Between Free Enterprise and Big Government Will Shape America's Future. Of course, we've had him on the program. And at the time, he made the case that we're really in a 70-30 nation. About 70% think we would be better off in a free market. But it's good news is 70% still believe that. I don't think it's up to 70% now. But the bad news is 30% are the ones in control of such key areas as that. Then I take on the question, well, shouldn't we reject the idea of a free market? Because after all, doesn't the Bible teach socialism? And I take you through, of course, Acts 4, which reminds us that even when you look at the book of Acts, which is oftentimes the one that is pointed to, even there, and we are certainly aware of the fact that when Peter confronts Ananias and Sapphira, which gets out then to Acts 5, he even says, this property that you gave while it remained, was it not your own? After it was sold, was it not in your control? And so the implication here is, even in the argument that is sometimes used by socialists to justify socialism from a biblical point of view, and it does not, even there it acknowledges something as simple as private property. Nevertheless, we're starting to see more and more young people say, well, I'm willing to give up private property because the economy is not working for me. And I think that's what is fueling a lot of this, even fueling the possibility, or really, let's say, the likelihood that Zohan Mamdani is going to be the next mayor in New York City, because the culture of crony capitalism isn't working for us. And there's some reasons for that. First of all, the money is broken. We've said this on this program many times before. I can see why Generation Y and now even Generation Z are saying it's not working because the value of the dollar keeps declining, but my wages don't keep going up. So as a result, if you invest in assets, whether it's property or stocks or even Bitcoin, that is going up, but my wages are going down. And so I'm having trouble paying for food and rent. I'd like to own a house. I doubt I'll ever own a house. And you can understand some of the real concerns because, as they say, this situation and the economy sometimes is rigged. And it is rigged because, and we have an Outlook magazine coming out about the Federal Reserve. We've talked many times about the loss of purchasing power of the dollar. And even when the decision was made yesterday to lower interest rates, they were acknowledging at the Federal Reserve that we don't have inflation under control, and every time inflation is there, and it has not run away at all. We have had inflation as high as 9%. Even now it's 2 and 3%. And of course, as you've heard me say before, the consumer price index is really sort of a phony index anyway. And so as a result, you can understand why people are frustrated, especially when the best example that you can come up with for maybe the idea of a free market is what many of us have called crony capitalism. And so that's why near the end of my booklet that we make available to you, we mention other books that maybe help you think through how to address this issue, either from a conservative point of view, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, or maybe from a Christian point of view, Michael Craven and people like Jay Richards and others, and John Stapleford, to really begin to think about how to address this issue of a free enterprise system. But I do come back to basic concepts. One of those is private property. Does the Bible talk about private property? Of course it does. Thou shalt not steal is based on the assumption that some people can own property and that you can exchange property in a free economy, whereas the Communist Manifesto, which is the real, if you will, philosophical foundation for modern socialism, calls for the abolition of property. And we see more and more individuals saying, I don't really have a problem if the government takes over every area of the economy. In a minute, we'll talk about how that hasn't worked so well in various socialist economies. So certainly one of the biggest concerns is this issue of private property. In the booklet, of course, I go through quite a number of others, but not the least of which is when you have a decentralized economic situation, economic freedom, by its definition, also leads to more political freedom. If you reduce the size and scope of government and the ways in which it controls the economy, by definition, you also reduce the size and scope of what the government does in the political realm. So economic freedom and political freedom go hand in hand, and we have many times posted various diagrams and graphs to show how that works out. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get to our second booklet. That's on socialism. We've had 25 different socialist experiments in the world. How are they working out? what might even happen in New York City, say a year from now? I think we have a pretty good idea. We don't have to guess. We have history. We have the receipts. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, this is We Can Talk About a Biblical View on Socialism. And if you just joined us again, there is an opportunity for you to get either one of these booklets, and you can download them. Of course, if you write to us or call us, we'll be glad to send them as well. The one on socialism is very easy to deal with historically because I quote from Dinesh D'Souza, who wrote a book and did also a movie about this, in which he talks about that the first socialist experiment was in the Soviet Union. Then came lots of countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, Yugoslavia, Albania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. Then he says, we'll add to that countries in Asia. That'd be Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, North Korea, and China. And then you have countries in South America, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela. And then if you go to Africa, well, that's Angola, Ghana, Tanzania, Benin, Mali, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And if you just use that alone, that's 25 failed experiments in socialism. But we know that what is oftentimes the response is, well, they just didn't get it right that time. And so if we really take the time to craft it more carefully, we won't have the problems that we had in these other countries. And sometimes when you're engaged in a conversation, I give you one of the videos there by Anders Hagström, when you ask, what about socialism? He says, well, a liberal says we should be a socialist, and a conservative will then point to Venezuela and say that, well, socialism doesn't work. The liberal says, well, what about Sweden and Norway? At this point, oftentimes the conservative rightly will say they aren't actually socialist. But don't take my word for it, because that is exactly what you hear from a variety of individuals. Bernie Sanders uses this illustration, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and there are some real problems with that kind of argument. And I quote from a very good video that was done by John Stossel, but also I've seen some other writing that he did, but he talked with a very prominent Swedish historian. His name is Johan Norberg, in which he said, look, Sweden is not socialist because the government doesn't own the means of production. To see that, you have to go to Venezuela or Cuba. Now, he does admit in the video, and again, we give you links so you can watch them to yourself and you can find the articles if you would like, that there was a time in which certainly in Sweden there was a real experiment in what you might call democratic socialism, and the government heavily taxed the citizens, spent very heavily, and this turned out to not have been a very good period for Swedish history and for the Swedish economy. One of the examples I love to use is Astrid Lindgren, who is the author of the popular children's books Pippi Longstocking. Anybody remember Pippi Longstocking, those books? Well, those books were very popular, but the problem with her is that given her tax status, she actually had to pay a tax of 102% on any new book that she sold. And so even with the high Swedish taxes, there was swimmingly not enough to even make that work. And as a result, as Norberg points out, quote, people couldn't get the pension that they thought they depended on for the future. And at this point, some of the Swedish people had enough and began to reduce the size and scope of government. John Stossel goes on to say they cut public spending, they privatized the national rail network, they abolished certain government monopolies, they eliminated inheritance taxes, sold state-owned businesses like the maker of Absolute Vodka. And while it is true that Sweden does have a larger welfare state than the U.S. and higher taxes than the U.S., there are many areas where Sweden is actually more free market than even the United States. So one of the other sort of arguments for Sweden and for socialism and for many of those people right now that are supporting Zohan Mamdani is the issue of equality. And I will be the first to admit that there is a very concerning wealth gap. I think I already illustrated why that is the case. We have a rigged system where if you own assets, or if you're the elite, or if you're close to the money printer, that'd be the Federal Reserve, you benefit very well. But if you are not one of those individuals, you pay a very heavy price, especially with this ongoing inflation. And so the argument would be we should make it more equal. But even if we could actually do all we can to level the economic environment, and I think we should do more of that, there are some things that we can and should do. But first of all, you have to acknowledge there's a problem before you can fix a problem, and we've said that on the program before. This moral argument about fairness still is difficult if you allow any amount of freedom. The example I use in the booklet is LeBron James, and now I guess it's a variety of other individuals in the NBA make about $37 million a year. Steph Curry, I think, has even exceeded that. But when I wrote this, it was LeBron James. But okay, Steph Curry, LeBron James, whoever you want to use. And that doesn't seem fair when a typical social worker starts out only making $30,000 a year. And so we recognize that even if you tried to make everything equal, there are different skills, there are different abilities, there are different motivations for people participating in a free market. And while we sometimes say that feels a little bit odd, as soon as you allow freedom and a free market, you're going to get that. But we also, from a historical point of view, as I point out, have historical ideas. We got to see what East Germany looked like compared to West Germany. And these two countries, when they were unified, were very different because you saw very significantly that the GDP of East Germany was about a third of the GDP of West Germany until they were merged. But probably the best example, and one that we've even produced a video on that you can find on our website, is the difference between North Korea and South Korea. Because basically Korea is Korea. But North Korea is a place where, if nothing else, there is no economic dynamism compared to South Korea. And so as a result, this shows very clearly, and even if you've ever seen satellite pictures at night of the lights in South Korea and the darkness in North Korea, or simply the fact that people in South Korea live 12 years longer than people in North Korea. People in South Korea are taller and healthier than people in North Korea. These are some very good and many of the very compelling arguments against socialism. I could obviously go on, but we're out of time. But one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this is tomorrow we will focus on this new survey, which shows that there is an increasing number of individuals in America that are convinced that we need to go towards socialism and we need to reject capitalism. And I think there are some very good reasons why we should identify some of the concerns of crony capitalism and a broken system and broken money. But it's not a reason to then adopt democratic socialism. It's a failed experiment. We've seen it in terms of history. We've seen it in terms of demographics. And we certainly recognize that that's something we'll continue to talk about here on Point of View. That's all we have for today. Don't forget that tomorrow is our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford, Merrill Matthews will be with us. If you find yourself wanting to get some more of these articles or resources, are available at our website at pointofview.net. I want to thank both of the Megans for their help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our weekend edition right here on Point of View.
As you likely know, our nation is approaching its 250th anniversary. And at Point of View, we are on a mission to restore America's godly heritage. But we do need your help. The first step in restoring America's godly heritage is educating people about the biblical truth that shaped our nation, including the truth that God is our creator and the source of our rights. The truth that people, including those in government, are prone to sin, and the truth that freedom requires internal moral guidance, which comes from belief in God. Point of View educates listeners on these truths every day, but we need support from people like you in order to operate. The best way to join in our mission to restore America's godly heritage is by joining the Truth Team. Learn more at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.